It was all going so well for Xi Jinping. China was successfully conducting a delicate geopolitical balancing act, maintaining ties in the East and West, while developing itself into an economic and military superpower. Sure, there were issues. Its relationship with the US was particularly strained, though its economic ties remained strong. But China had a plan that even those hiccups weren't going to derail. Then, Putin invaded Ukraine. With that decision, he unraveled so much of China's strategy, forcing it to rethink what it was doing on its path to creating military supremacy. But why did that happen? How could a war that started thousands of miles away from China have such a massive impact on its geopolitical ambitions? It all starts with the simple fact that China has deepened its ties to Russia in recent years. Though it's easy to assume that China and Russia are direct allies, especially given the media coverage that suggests they are, the reality is much more complex. Going back over the decades, the relationship between the two countries was always fractured. Following the signing of the 1950 Treaty of Friendship, essentially allying China and the Soviet Union due to their shared communist ideals, differences in ideology started to form. When Nikita Khrushchev came to power in 1953, he quickly set about denouncing many of Joseph Stalin's policies, angering China in the process. They'd signed their Treaty of Friendship because Chairman Mao's ideas meshed well with Stalin's. To see the Soviet Union's new leadership move away from those ideals threatened the alliance almost as soon as it began. By 1960, the Sino-Soviet split was official, with the Soviet Union recalling all of its specialists from China in that year. What followed were decades of tension that only abated with the reforging of the relationship between China and Russia in the 21st century. It's an unofficial alliance. China and Russia don't have the beginnings of their own NATO going on, but it existed nonetheless. That loose alliance is what has created so many problems for China's military strategy. When Putin invaded Ukraine, Xi was forced into the near impossible position of supporting Russia while simultaneously denouncing it. His response was to continue denouncing the West, with the United States landing in his crosshairs. The Wilson Center says that according to Beijing, the US was at least partially to blame for the Ukraine war because Washington has spent years ignoring Russia's security worries. If only the United States had worked closer with Russia, Beijing says, it would have come to a peaceful resolution that would have averted the war. But Xi couldn't stick with that message alone. He also placed the blame on Russia for starting the war, creating instability throughout Europe. While Xi is quick to point out U.S. involvement in Ukraine as being key to prolonging the war, he's also wary of Russia winning because that win would only expand Putin's power base. As an August 2023 CNN report put it, China's ideal scenario would be to ensure Russia stays in a Goldilocks state, not so strong that it could threaten China, but also not so weak that it couldn't offer solid support should China need it. So Xi's been forced to convey mixed messages. On one hand, he denounced the West, with a particular focus on the US, for creating the situation in which the war could occur in the first place. But he also has Beijing's interests in mind. He needs to maintain close ties with many Western powers to maintain the cooperative economic strategy that allows him to fund his own war machine. The result is a somewhat muted condemnation of Russia to go along with the assignment of blame to the US. Xi is used to complex balancing acts, but this may be a problem that stretches beyond even his ability to keep everybody happy, at least on the surface level. And nowhere is that more obvious than when we look into China's ties with the European Union, or the EU. According to the European Commission, the EC, China is the largest importer of goods into the EU, being responsible for 20.8% of those imported products in 2022. It's also a huge exporter, buying up to 9% of the goods that the EU produced in that year, making it the organization's third largest exporter. All told, 856 billion euros, approximately $922.21 billion of trade took place between China and the EU in 2022. A near trillion-dollar relationship that China can't afford to lose. That's where Putin's war comes into play. In addition to being one of China's biggest trading partners, the EU is also the biggest provider of military and financial aid to Ukraine. According to Statista, the EU committed 84.8 billion euros, approximately $91 billion to Ukraine, between January 2022 and the end of July 2023, outspending the US by over $15 billion. You can see the conflict of interest forming. China wants a great relationship with the EU. It needs that relationship for several reasons. The economic benefits are obvious, with the sheer volume of goods the EU exports from China delivering hundreds of billions of dollars that Xi can use to strengthen his country's military. But it's also worth noting that China's close economic ties to it give a voice in EU policy. That voice may not be direct and obvious, but it is there. The EU stands to gain from its alliance with China too. By fostering this relationship, Xi had cleverly put himself into a position where he could at least have some sort of influence over European geopolitics. That's a situation he wants to maintain. But as Chatham House reports, the majority of people in China support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They see it as a way to prevent the US from establishing satellite states in Europe, expanding its power base, which ultimately benefits China. This ignores the intricacies of China's relationship with the EU, leaving Xi with the previously mentioned difficult position of trying to walk a tightrope between maintaining his alliance with Russia while simultaneously condemning them for the war. That's why he's so focused on blaming the US. It's not Europe's fault that Putin invaded Ukraine, Xi says, attempting to appease the EU in the process. It's the United States that's to blame. It didn't take Russia's concerns seriously. The problem is, the United States is another of China's main trading partners. According to the Bureau of Industry and Security, 16.5% of America's $3.2 trillion in imports came from China in 2022. That amounts to $432 billion. Less than EU imports, but still a huge chunk of money that China can put towards strengthening its military. Bear in mind that this heavy importing also comes amidst the many sanctions the US imposed on China during the Trump administration. Xi accepted these sanctions through gritted teeth, all to keep trade open as he could, knowing that the money he gets from the US helps to fuel his military ambitions. Now he's trying to cast the US as one of the guilty parties in Putin's war. The complicated blame game hasn't affected Chinese exports to the US just yet, but Washington won't be happy about it, creating the possibility of more sanctions in the future. Very bad news for China. And if the EU limits its imports as well, China will suddenly lose billions of dollars, shaking its economy and, by extension, Xi's military growth ambitions. It's a scenario that has precedent. Once Putin declared war against Ukraine, many Western countries quickly moved their trade and investment away from Russia. It punished Moscow by restricting its access to Western money, with the intended goal of being to punish Putin for his actions while making it harder for him to get money that he could spend on his military. If tensions with China escalate, both because of Xi's indirect support of Russia and some of China's ambitions in other countries, we could see the same happen. The sanctions imposed on Beijing during Trump's presidency could pale in comparison. The sanctions imposed on Beijing during Trump's presidency could pale in comparison to those imposed if the US and other Western countries limited their trade and investment. And it's not like those Western countries don't have options if the hammer came down on China. India, Vietnam, several other developing countries all have manufacturing bases that could benefit from Western investment. On the flip side, China isn't going to find any trading partners that rival the US and the EU in sheer spending power. It's simple. Xi needs Western money to fund his military. Putin's invasion created tensions in China's relationships with the Western powers upon which it relies to buy the goods it manufactures. That leaves Xi walking an even more delicate tightrope, a tight string perhaps, to keep his military funded. That attempt to maintain some semblance of balance could also have a negative impact on Russia. Yes, China has continued to trade with Russia, hampering the West's efforts to isolate Putin in the process, but Xi hasn't agreed to everything Russia wants to do. For instance, March 2023 saw Xi visit Moscow for a meeting about the partnership between Russia and China. While he was quick to praise that partnership, he stopped short of doing two things Putin really wanted: supplying lethal weapons and agreeing to construction of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Putin took those shots on the chin, with Russia being equally quick to praise China for its supposed neutrality and lack of bias regarding the war. Plus, the relationship is clearly going strong, with International Politik Quarterly reporting that China's exports to Russia increased by 67.2% during the first 6 months of 2023. Military cooperation in training exercises is at an all-time high. Still, Putin will take notice of the fact that China isn't offering unconditional outward support to Russia, which could cause fractures in the relationship in the future. So, another potential problem for China. But let's switch focus to something that may have a more direct impact on Xi's military strategy. Assuming he's able to maintain the flow of cash from the West while keeping his ties to Moscow strong, he may still face a four-letter problem: NATO. According to the Rand Corporation, Putin's invasion has played a large role in strengthening NATO. This military alliance has always been seen as a bastion of Western power, with many, including people in China, with anti-West sentiments, claiming it to be a puppet alliance that supports America's geopolitical ambitions. By invading Ukraine, Putin gave the countries that were already members of NATO a reason to start working even more closely. They're actively cooperating to hinder Putin's ambitions, creating new strategies and strengthening alliances, while learning lessons on how to deal with a similar situation in the future along the way. That is terrible news for Xi. The stronger NATO gets, the more of an opposing force it could be if Xi looks to expand China's territory in the future. And after learning lessons from the Ukraine invasion, NATO would be in an even better position to stop China from doing something similar in Taiwan. Xi is very aware of this problem. It's why Beijing's so quick to denounce NATO over almost everything it does, such as the possibility of NATO expanding into Asia. When NATO states concerns over China's ambitions on the continent, Xi's government is quick to fire back, rejecting those concerns, while criticizing the very concept of allowing countries like Japan and South Korea to join the organization. Simply put, Xi sees NATO as a threat. And he should. NATO sees him as a threat too. But it's not just the strengthening of current alliances within NATO that Putin's invasion prompted. Even if we ignore the possibility of Asian countries joining the group, the war in Ukraine has also led to more European countries wanting to join. According to NATO itself, 4 countries have declared aspirations to become a part of NATO: Georgia, Sweden, Ukraine, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. On top of that, Finland joined the group in April 2023, while Sweden attended NATO meetings as an official invitee. Ukraine wants to join for obvious reasons. Being a NATO member means it gets even more support as it fights off Russia. Same goes for Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia, which could both be future targets of Putin's ambitions if he's successful in Ukraine. But it's Finland and Sweden that are the real headliners here. For decades, those countries have maintained neutral stances in global geopolitics, not being interested in fighting other people's wars or having others fight for them. That's changed. Putin's invasion placed national security at the front of their agenda for every European country, including 2 of the continent's most prominent neutral powers. Not only have alliances with NATO strengthened thanks to the war, but Putin has inadvertently prompted countries that may not even be on his radar to want to join. New alliances are being formed. The West is growing stronger. This isn't what Xi wants. While he may be able to argue against Asian countries joining NATO, he has practically no influence on the actions of European countries. Whatever influence his trade agreements with the EU grants him, it doesn't stretch that far. Because of Putin, Xi is being forced to sit back and watch as NATO grows ever stronger. And with even more countries under its banner, NATO may be able to make a better case for allowing the likes of Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia to join. A disastrous scenario for Xi. The scenario is so bad for Xi's military strategy that we're already starting to see opinion pieces pop up in Chinese news publications condemning the expansion efforts. One piece published in the South China Morning Post in July 2023 highlighted NATO's identification of China as a problem and claimed that NATO is clearly trying to start a Cold War with China. That's not the truth. For all the tensions that exist between China and the West, neither side wants a Cold War. But pieces like this show that Xi is worried about what a stronger NATO could mean for China's increasing presence in Asia. If NATO were to include Japan and South Korea, Xi would suddenly have 2 major military powers nearby that are backed by the US and a huge chunk of Europe. It would be exactly the sort of constant oversight Xi wants to avoid, and it could prevent him from doing the thing that he really wants to do: absorb Taiwan into China. We touched on the Taiwan situation earlier. It's no secret Xi would love to bring Taiwan under Beijing's auspices. His people would love it too, not least because many believe that Taiwan is rightfully a part of China. Of course, Taiwan thinks differently, but Xi has been making his intentions known as recently as September 2023, when Taiwan began talking about abnormal Chinese military exercises being conducted far too close for comfort. Those exercises included drills being held on land that directly faces the small island, as well as naval training exercises just off the coast. Taiwan claims that it saw drones, bombers, and dozens of fighter jets, and even had to deal with the presence of the Shandong aircraft carrier during these exercises. For its part, China's claimed that the drills were simply held to combat the arrogance of Taiwanese separatist forces. But the message was clear to all those who were watching. Xi is slowly preparing to attack Taiwan. But could that attack even happen now? The Taiwanese people see clear parallels between their situation and that of Ukraine, and even though its leaders likely see the same parallels, they didn't draw attention to them even as they made their support for Ukraine clear mere days after Putin's war started. Plus, just as several European countries responded to the war by trying to cozy up to NATO, Taiwan responded by taking steps to strengthen itself. In August 2022, Taiwan's leaders proposed increasing military spending to $19 billion for 2023, over $2 billion more than it had spent in 2022. Furthermore, its president, Tsai Ing-wen, brought back year-long mandatory military service for all of the island's men, extending each man's compulsory service by 8 months. None of this would help Taiwan to fend off China if she decided to invade. But it's still bad news for his military strategy, because even a slightly stronger and more prepared Taiwan is a tougher prospect than the pre-war Taiwan would have been. And on top of that, China has now seen firsthand how the West might respond if it were to launch its own invasion. It would see an expansion of Chinese power as an issue. And in the case of the US, President Joe Biden has said on multiple occasions that the United States would send support to Taiwan should an invasion happen. What that support might actually consist of is somewhat ambiguous, but it could mean troops to go along with more weapons. Of course, Biden has backtracked on those comments because strategic ambiguity is the official line for America's approach to Taiwan. But they may indicate where Biden's thoughts lie about the whole situation. Many countries in Europe would likely share the opinion that a stronger China is bad news, especially given China's ties to Russia. While European countries likely wouldn't send armed forces, Xi's invasion now could lead to an influx of money and weaponry into Taiwan that would make any war a protracted effort. Add to that fact that the US has essentially been arming Taiwan since the 1970s, and it's not outside of the realms of possibility that it would increase the flow of weapons into the island to thwart China. After all, Taiwan not being under Chinese control is a win for the US. It surely receives some level of military intelligence in exchange for its weapons. She must be wondering if America's willingness to support Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars would mean that same level of support would be forthcoming to Taiwan if he invaded. That would make an invasion far from the smash and grab that Xi wanted. Of course, Xi has been crafty when it comes to Taiwan. In November 2023, he assured Biden that China has no plans to attack the island in the, quote, coming years. But again, he's been sending mixed messages. That attack may not come in the next few years, but Xi has also made it clear that he believes the absorption of Taiwan into China to be inevitable. He clearly has ambitions there. However, Putin may be the reason why that absorption won't happen anytime soon. Xi will likely have to wait for Russia's war to end and for the dust to settle before he makes any move that many would see as being similar to Putin's war. Still, that delay, assuming Xi wanted to invade anytime soon, could actually play into China's hands. As well as seeing the potential scale of support Taiwan might receive from the West, Xi is learning lessons from Putin's war. He's seeing firsthand what Beijing could do to circumvent economic sanctions. Russia could come in handy there, for instance. The fact that Taiwan is an island will also play in his favor. It's tough to escape Taiwan, especially with a Chinese navy patrolling the waters. And the island is small enough that China could use its navy as a barrier to prevent aid from coming through. Nevertheless, widespread condemnation of Putin's war, especially in the West, will give Xi pause for thought and slow down his Taiwanese ambitions. Of course, Xi isn't sitting back and helplessly watching his plans unravel. Putin may have thrown a wrench into the works of his military strategizing, but China hasn't slowed down much. It's used the Ukrainian invasion to further its own agenda, as we saw during the first news conference held by the new Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang. He used that conference to talk about how Asia shouldn't fall into the same trap that Europe fell into, saying the continent should be a stage for win-win cooperation rather than a chessboard for geopolitical contest. He went on to emphasize the importance of cooperation, towing Xi's line in the process, though he also couldn't resist getting a shot in at the United States, referring to America's Indo-Pacific strategy as a means to, quote, provoke a confrontation by plotting an Asia-Pacific version of NATO. He also claimed that China had no hand in Putin's war, making the point that China hasn't officially provided weapons to either side. Again, the mixed messages and the blame game. At the conclusion of his message, Qin highlighted what he believed China needed to do: grab some more microphones. In other words, China needs an even bigger voice on the world stage. And to get that voice, Xi is going to continue with the subversive military strategy that he had before Putin launched his war. Yes, he's been delayed. Yes, he's seen how the West might respond if he were to launch his own invasion of Taiwan. But he's not going to stop building China's power base. That building will continue through the BRICS group, which has welcomed new members and is looking to continually expand to benefit the economies of its members while giving China a stronger voice in Asia and South America. It will also continue through China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, which has seen the country lend out billions of dollars to smaller nations to help them build infrastructure. Ostensibly, the BRI is a way for China to build stronger trade routes, connecting it to the rest of the world. But it's also a way for Xi to foster cooperation with many of the smaller nations that might otherwise have relied on the West for help. And, if everything goes south, it provides him with leverage should he need to quickly expand his military presence. So, Xi has problems. He's walking a tightrope between the East and West, with Russia as something of a wild card, trying to cooperate with them all economically so he can continue to fund his own military ambitions. Putin's war delayed those ambitions. It's made Xi's relationships with the US and the EU tenser, and perhaps forced him into a rhetoric that he might not otherwise use. But make no mistake about it, China will continue to pursue its strategy of building its military through cooperation. That cooperation comes both economically and by establishing itself as the helping hand for many smaller nations that may feel like the West has forgotten about them. Xi just has to be careful, subversively diplomatic. But if China and Xi have shown us anything over the last few decades, it's that the country is more than capable of balancing on the tightrope that Putin created. So what do you think about the whole situation? Has Putin's war affected China and its military ambitions in ways that we haven't covered in this video? What other tricks do you believe Xi has hidden up his sleeve? Tell us what you think below, and thank you for watching the video. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.